Welcome to this video tutorial. In this video, we will continue building our small VR fighting game prototype. In the previous video, we already started with the very first prototype and some dummies that were just punching but not aiming for us yet. And we already had some ragdoll physics so we could hit the dummy pretty hard and it would behave realistically in terms of bouncing around and reacting to our punches. We didn't have a solid body yet. We were only using the controller models for the HTC Vive. And in this video now, we want to extend that behavior and make the prototype a bit more engaging. One of the ways we're going to do that is we will start controlling our own character, so a full character model. And we will do this by using FinalIK with a small component called VRIK. There's a video tutorial by Partel, who is the author of FinalIK, and I will link this video tutorial below, and it shows us exactly how in a few easy steps we can link up our head-mounted display and hand controllers of the HTC Vive with the character model here. We will also be using DoTween, and that's a free asset in order to animate some values. And I will show you what we will be animating in a little bit. Alright, so let's have a look at the scene here and see what changed. First thing you might notice is that in the last video, we used NewtonVR to control our hand controllers and to punch the dummy. I disabled NewtonVR here because with this change to controlling a full character, I felt like it was more clunky to use NewtonVR. We didn't really need its functionality. And instead, I just drag and drop the camera rig of SteamVR in. So when we installed NewtonVR in our last video, we also imported SteamVR. In the SteamVR folder, in the prefabs folder, you can see this camera rig, and you can just drag and drop this in. And it will come with this outline here of the play space, and a camera, and the hand controllers. Once we've done this, I simply went over to the root motion folder, to FinalIK, and demos, and here at the very bottom there is a folder called VRIK. Here in the VRIK basic folder scene, there is a soldier or a 3D model, a character model that I copied and pasted, and this is this pilot here. Now the pilot in its root object has an animator, but it's disabled, so we're not using the animator. The character instead is driven by VRIK and not by animations. The way you set this VRIK up, it's basically already attached to this object. We just have to add a few reference in here for the spine, left and right arm. But Partel goes over this in his video tutorial, and I will link the video below, so you can just follow along. The only difference is that when we add the left hand and right hand to our controller objects here, I then also go to the model for the left and right hand controller, and there's a script called SteamVR render model, and I simply disable this because I don't want to see the controllers. Instead, I only want to control the hands and the character without seeing our hand controllers for the HTC Vive. See, those scripts are disabled. Alright, let's have a look at some of the other details that we changed since the last video. Pretty much all of the changes now are contained in our dummy opponent. I was struggling a little bit with PuppetMaster because for some reason PuppetMaster kept misaligning its colliders and basically breaking and not working anymore a couple times. But I have the feeling that might have been due to some of the things that I tested and tried out and that probably weren't compatible with PuppetMaster. But I'm still using the exact same dummy that we copied from one of the other PuppetMaster scenes. So if you're curious what the basic setup was, just head over to the previous video and you will see that we have this dummy opponent set up there. Let's go over some of the changes. Again, PuppetMaster is attached to this dummy PuppetMaster with its own hierarchy, with its own rig. The only change we make here is we change the head's muscle weight to 1. So that the head will not bounce around as much anymore when we hit it. We look at the dummy. Dummy had a look at IK script attached, and we're still using that same script. But on top of that, we're also adding a FullbodyBipedIK script that comes with FinalIK. That is because in the previous video, the dummy was punching just straight ahead without really targeting us. And now we want to be able to control the dummy's punches so that when we get close to the dummy will actually aim for our head. In order to achieve that, we add the script, and then we have to create a little script in order to change the target of the left-hand effector or right-hand effector. In this case, it's only the right-hand effector because the punch of the dummy is only punching with the right hand. And while the dummy here is pretty close now, when we're standing right in front of it, if we move over a little bit to the left or to the right, we want inverse kinematics to make sure that the hand still reaches our face, so that there's always a threat coming from the dummy. So the only change I made with this animation here is we have two animation events, and they call a function. It's called right hand target, and we set a float here. Now let me show you this script. It's called opponent behavior. And in opponent behavior, we're basically doing two things. The first one is we're changing the solver of the FullbodyBipedIK. And what we're doing here is we're setting the target. So the target is the player head. Right now, we're only punching towards the user's head. In the future, of course, we want to have a multitude of targets so that you can punch to whatever you're not guarding right now. So if you're all trying to defend your head, then maybe the dummy's going to land a straight punch to the stomach or something like that. But for now, we're only using the head as a target. And here we're using .tween, and we're using the namespace dg_tweening, and we're animating this value of the right-hand effector position weight over half a second. So over half a second, this value is going to ramp up from 0 to, in this case, in our animation, we set it to 0.6. So over here, starting from here, over the next half second, this punch will actually start being directed towards the head. And once we're done punching and we're resuming to go back to an idle position, then we're tweening again this value to be 0 just about here when we're done with the punch. Now this is a little bit hard to visualize because when I'm just scrubbing this timeline here, you don't really see the influence of the inverse kinematics. So that actually requires quite a bit of tweaking. So you play the scene, you change these values, you move those events back and forth a little bit, and you really just see what feels natural. Now, I can already tell you that just with these two events, it will not really feel natural yet, just because we haven't really allowed the dummy to move around yet and really to find the perfect distance for a punch. So most of the time right now, when we're just getting close to the dummy, the opponent will just punch and really stretch fairly far to reach us, which will look unnatural. But it's something that we have to do in the future, where the dummy has to move around and sort of follow us around, and always try to get close enough so that he can punch us. So that's really just a limitation right now, but we're taking this step by step. Okay, I also created a variation of this animation here, basically just the first part where you can see the dummy just sort of standing in place and just moving around a little bit, just like he's sparring, but without actually any punches. And I used this little part as an idle animation. It looks a little bit unnatural because it's not perfectly looping, but for now this is good enough just to have an idle animation. And what I want to do here is that I want to be able to control that when we're close enough to the dummy will switch from this idle animation over to the punching animation, and when we leave the proximity of the dummy, then it will switch back to the idle animation. And that is exactly the second thing that we're doing here in this opponent behavior script. We have a variable that's called isInProximity. We have two root objects that we can use as a distance calculation. And we also have a public float, which is the desired player distance. And what we do then here in update is we check whether this distance is larger or smaller than this set distance, and whether we're in proximity or not. Basically always triggering whether we're just entering the proximity of the dummy or leaving it. And when that's the case, then down here in process opponent distance, we're setting a trigger for either punching or going back to idle. Now when we're going back to idle, we also have to make sure that those silver right-hand effector values are actually reset to 0. So basically, we're using this tweening here to set them back to 0 so that our dummy doesn't get stuck trying to reach for us with the inverse kinematics. And then we're just flipping this spool to the opposite so that we're now out of proximity or in proximity, depending on what it was previously. And you will see in the video that this actually works quite well. We can just fairly seamlessly go in and out of the proximity of the dummy, and he will alternate between those two states. Okay, there's other ways to do this. I also tried just using colliders for this, or actually triggers. So I had a trigger volume that was all around the dummy here, and I had a trigger volume that was all around the headset here that's being tracked through this character. And whenever those two triggers intersect, then I was doing basically the exact same thing, that we were triggering those different animations. However, I kind of had the feeling that maybe... Oh no, never mind. I had the feeling that PuppetMaster was messing up because I was actually adding another rigid body here and a collision trigger to this dummy object. And I really had the feeling that that was causing the problems with with PuppetMaster. However, as you can see, I don't have those colliders on here now, and already my puppet is already messed up again. And you can see that here the hand is actually not aligned anymore, so that this collider is all misaligned. And you can see that overall the puppet is just a little bit sort of in front here. And I have the feeling that now what I just did here with scrubbing the timeline, I feel like this is connected to actually scrubbing the timeline or doing something with the animation with the dummy. I haven't really got a clue what exactly is causing this, because right now if I actually build this and play this, PuppetMaster will not work anymore. And so far the only way I could find to reset this was to completely build the dummy from scratch again, which I already have a default dummy up here, which is basically the last step before, you know, a couple of small tweaks to get to this one, but that one up here wouldn't break. That's quite annoying. I already emailed Partel, and I'm hoping to hear back from him to see whether we can fix this somehow and what is causing this so that we can avoid it in the future. So I really spent quite a lot of times rebuilding those dummies. I probably went through about 25 or so dummies in the last week, resetting those things up, because you can see the dummies looking straight a little bit up, and it's just completely misaligned now. So that made progress a little bit hard, but in the end I managed to build a couple of versions and test them out, and overall the functionality that we build feels quite fun. And I think the best experience of all is actually having a physical body, sort of the perception that you are now in the skin of this pilot here, walking around and with your actual hands can punch the dummy. It feels a bit awkward because the pilot here character doesn't have any fists yet. He's not making any fists, he's just hitting with a straight hand. But well, it's not perfect yet, but we're getting close. The other thing I did is to those controllers, to the left and right hand, which are, while they're not being tracked, they're down here by the feet. I added a sphere collider, a fairly small one, and a rigid body that is not using gravity and is using kinematics, so is kinematic. And that is because we need to collide with our dummy somehow, because per se, those joints, so the hands here don't have any collision. So I just added some small spheres. Now I have to tweak those spheres and maybe try to get a better approximation of the fists or of the hand of those characters, but for now it's good enough to smack our dummy in the head. The other thing I did was those objects here that are part of the VRIK setup, I had to put them on the character layer. If you remember in our last video, up here for our custom puppet behavior, we have a collision layer set up. And this collision layer is set to character, so that our dummy here only collides with the character layer. So whatever we put on this layer is going to collide with the dummy. And I didn't want to put the whole character for now into this layer. Instead, I only used the left and the right hand. Now later on, we will have to think about a solution that the dummy can hit us as well. So we will need some collision functionality, like full body against full body, so that hits back and forth can be exchanged, but we'll worry about that later. Okay, what else have we done? We have one other thing that I can talk about here, and that is, I call this opponent condition, and that is a way to sort of keep track of the health of the dummy, so that in the future we will be able to knock out our dummy and to have his health, the opponent's health, deteriorate over time as we hit him. So we have something called a body part here, which is slightly different to the muscles that PuppetMaster is using. I wanted to use something different that's independent of the PuppetMaster. That is because we need to define a couple of values here, something like health and max health. And we want to attach those things to the groups that are part of PuppetMaster, because we want to tie our health to the stiffness or the properties of PuppetMaster for certain body parts to be able to be knocked out or not, or how stiff they are, how resistant they are to incoming forces. So if we look at our dummy, a PuppetMaster dummy, you can see here that our head has all these different variables like mapping weight, muscle weight. Right now I'm using muscle weight. I might actually try some of the other values as well, and see that as the health of our dummy diminishes, those weights are being decreased so that the head will actually react more to incoming punches. So as you might think that if you hit the dummy the first time in the head, he will not flinch as much. But sort of towards the end, when he's already taken the beating, that his head will really get slammed back, and the dummy will stumble around and probably then also fall over at the end. And that's when we kind of have to make adjustments to some of those weights so that they're not pinned down anymore, and the dummy can actually fall over once we knock him out. So what I'm doing there is, let's go to opponent condition. This is really just right now providing reference to the body parts that I created. And the body part only has those variables here, so health, max health, and a reference to a muscle. However, what we're doing is all done here in the custom puppet behavior. We wrote the script last time in the last video, and I just expanded it slightly. So what I did here is I have a reference for opponent condition. Then all the changes are down here when we actually collide with a muscle. So one of the changes here is that we find out which body part we collided with. So we get the body part based on the muscle. And then if we actually collided with one of the defined body parts, now for now I only have the head defined, so this only works right now when punching the head, but eventually I will cover all the other body parts as well. What happens then is we take the magnitude of the impulse of the collision and we subtract that from our health. Not from the max health, but from the health. And then we adjust the muscle weight, so the variable of PuppetMaster to define how responsive that muscle is. And we subtract from it. In this case, sort of the target health divided by 100. And those are the kind of values we really need to tweak to see sort of what feels the most responsive and how the dummy really takes a good beating, like a visual beating over time. And what I'm doing down here is I'm logging some errors, and that is really just so that I get the console in my build, so that when I'm actually in VR, like when I'm testing the prototype, I can just kind of peek out at the side and see on the screen to see what the error message says. And the error message basically just tells me sort of what the muscle weight right now is, and whether the dummy is already knocked out or not, theoretically knocked out. And I'm not logging any debug messages here, just because the log error is just a very simple way for me to have this information pop up in a development build instantly, so that I don't have to look at the debug log later and kind of parse through these things. I just want to basically hit the dummy once and see what kind of effect that had and how much of the health was subtracted and so on, so to really be able to test these things as I hit the dummy. That's why we're logging error messages. Obviously, we have to take these things out later when we actually want to play our build. And also, the first time that you actually log one of these error messages, there's a slight lag. It kind of feels a bit unnatural because of the error that's being registered. After the first error, then there's no more lag, but that's just something to keep in mind. Now, one other question might be, why am I using these body parts? Why not use the muscles themselves? And the reason is that the muscles are fairly global. They're fairly large areas, so the head is just one part of PuppetMaster. And I haven't found a good way yet to add to this list of muscles. So what I wanted to do is basically, I wanted to define different parts of the dummy that I can damage independently. I wanted to define the nose, the chin, the temples, and maybe the back of the head as more vulnerable than maybe just the top of the head. And by doing so, I could then make some of those parts more susceptible to damage. and sort of have an increased value being deducted from the overall health of the head or of the dummy, so that we can encourage more precise punches. So when you hit the dummy square in the nose, it will be different. Or when you maybe hit the dummy like with a hard punch in the temple, it will knock him out instantly, because that's that's an area that a human being usually is very easily hurt and can really knock you out very, very easily. And I tried adding some of those muscles myself, pretty much just by going in and going to the PuppetMaster and adding like muscles here. But for some reason, I did not manage to do that. This could also be compounded with the problem I'm having with my dummy misaligning. So, but I'll test this later when this whole misalignment problem here is being solved. Then I might go back and actually define these and maybe get rid of body parts again. So I'll just right now some testing. I just wanted to get started with being able to define some health for my dummy. And so far it feels pretty good. Now the weird thing is our dummy's not being knocked out yet, as you will see in the video of me testing this. The head will actually sort of almost detach. It will just kind of flop down once the health or this weight reaches 0. So again, I will probably be experimenting with some other values besides the muscle weight. I might just try to use the mapping weight instead and see how that feels in terms of the head being bounced back to incoming punches. All right, there's one last thing that I added, and that is something that's also quite a lot of fun, and that is a haptic pulse. So whenever we collide with a muscle, we get a haptic pulse. And that's a little bit of I wouldn't say a tricky topic, but it's it's just a weird way to set these controller vibrations up. And that is because haptic pulse here has a variable called strength, but when you actually look here, the parameter for trigger haptic pulse is called duration. However, this value in here, this parameter, has nothing to do with the duration. It is purely a strength value, and the strength is an integer between 0 and 3,999. And so, if you want a really strong pulse, you would use 3,999. I actually might consider reducing this a little bit because it's a very strong pulse and probably draining the batteries of the controllers quite a lot. But it's a really, really strong, just short pulse, and feels pretty good, really responsive. Now, the solution to this, not having sort of a length value for this vibration, is we have to create a for loop. And we basically have to call this trigger haptic pulse for as long as we want the pulse to continue. So in our case, I tested and I found that a vibration or a haptic pulse of about 0.1 seconds felt pretty good, like nice and short, really crisp, sort of when you hit the dummy. And so we're basically calling this trigger haptic pulse for 0.1 of a second. And you can see here through this, we do this through this for loop. And we're also distinguishing between right and left. So if the game object that collides with us contains right or contains left, then we trigger this haptic pulse, or we call the coroutine controller vibration. Actually, I might change this because we're actually looking at the name of so we're testing for a string here. Then we can do this differently. We can just look at the game object or something. Now, I had some problems with this when I was not using the simple sphere collider of our character that we have located at the fists, but when I was using the hand controller of the HTC Vive. That is because the hand controller of the HTC Vive is composed of all these different small parts, and has a number of different colliders, which means it would always register several collisions at the same time, because all these different small colliders would collide with our target. And then since the controller is created or instantiated at runtime, it's really hard to really tease apart which part is colliding and how are they being named, and so on and so on. So I decided I'm just going with left and right in their name. That sort of worked. We still had multiple collisions per hit. But I feel like right now that we have this one collider for each hand, so just this one sphere collider, which is either left or right, this works quite well. All right, so I think there's still lots and lots of things to do. I definitely want the dummy to be able to walk around and sort of to follow me at a certain distance and kind of make sure it's always facing us. That will be quite an interesting undertaking. And then we need to extend sort of the damaging behavior so that we can define all these body parts and damage them individually. And I think right now what's blocking my progress the most is all of these misalignments here, because as you saw before, I was really just scrubbing the timeline, just looking at the animations and tweaking things. And all of a sudden the dummy is completely useless and I have to set him up from scratch again. So once I find a solution for this, hopefully I'll hear from Partel pretty soon. We can resolve this. Then I'll be posting a new video. However, I'm also suspecting that Character Creator 3 will be released in the next couple days, because they announced it for September and we only have a couple days left in September. So hopefully my next video might actually be on Character Creator 3. If that's the case, then one of the videos pertaining to this project will probably be importing a new Character Creator 3 character to this scene here, and then setting up, instead of using one of those dummies, those already existing dummies that came with the project, we will be using our own custom characters. And that will be quite interesting as well, because then you won't be punching a dummy, but you will be actually punching a living and breathing, well, sort of a character that might look much more realistic. And that'll be interesting, because then we also have eyes, we can have eye contact and all these different things. And then I think it'll be quite a lot of fun. But I can already tell you that now, with the sort of illusion of having your own body in VR, it's quite entertaining. It feels completely different again from just having the floating hand controllers, and it's quite a lot of fun. And I definitely encourage you to try this out. And even if you're not building a fighting game like this, just try out FinalIK's VRIK, and it makes such a huge difference to have your own presence of a body that you're moving around in. It's remarkable. And again, I had a couple of people test this, and they were all astonished how realistically it felt. That's about all the updates I have for now. If you have any questions, please write a comment below. I'm going to answer all of them. I hope this video was useful for you, and thanks for watching. I will see you next time.